In the progressive era of the Enlightenment, with the Industrial Revolution approaching, Europe was gripped by a frenzy of exhuming the dead and piercing their hearts with sharpened stakes. There is a hypothesis that people attributed epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis, which ravaged the 18th and 19th centuries, to the machinations of vampires. But was it really that simple? Blood is the primary symbol of life and culture, and thus the undead will always hunt for it. Legends about spirits and creatures that drain life forces are tied to archetypal fears. While varying greatly in form, these legends share certain similarities. The vampire is a metaphor for an evil other, defying the laws of nature, a dead being that walks. It is the dark double of the living, literally carrying death. It lacks selfhood, but it is ravenous, driven by emptiness and a thirst for blood. Tales of blood-sucking demons were mentioned as early as ancient Sumer. Stories of creatures from folklore, reanimated corpses that feed on human blood, exist in the mythologies of peoples worldwide, from the Filipino manananggal, which splits in half to hunt at night, to the Chinese zhangshi, which feeds on life energy, and vampire-like beings in the folklore of Australian Aboriginals. In Eastern Europe, beliefs about upyrs, ghouls or vampires, emerged in the 10th to 11th centuries. A popular view holds that these beliefs spread from there to Western Europe. For instance, France and Italy had no native bloodsuckers. Their legends came from the Balkans and were later assimilated. Other opinions suggest that walking corpses occasionally appear in medieval Western legends, such as those in England. Historically, malevolent forces were always detected where the established order was disrupted. According to folk beliefs, vampires were those who stood out, such as individuals with congenital deformities or distinctive physical traits, e.g., red hair and blue eyes. A foreigner was highly likely to be labeled a vampire. The undead were also those who died under mysterious circumstances, from strange illnesses, were buried without proper rituals, or whose bodies showed unusual changes. A string of deaths in one family was deemed suspicious. Surely one of them was a vampire visiting their kin. To protect the living, an apotropaic ritual was performed to ward off evil forces. These rituals varied by local tradition. Sometimes they dealt with a walking corpse, sometimes with a restless spirit whose buried body needed neutralization. The dead were prevented from leaving their graves, pacified to replace unnatural, living death with ordinary death, or appeased through offerings, a ritual exchange with the world of the dead. The term vampire appeared relatively late and became entrenched through the press and Gothic novels. The word is considered South Slavic, entering German from Serbian in the early 18th century, and from there spreading to French and English. The first mentions of vampires in England appear in newspapers of the 1730s, reporting news from southeastern Europe. Vampire legends likely reached America in the 1700s, brought by Palatine Germans colonizing Pennsylvania or Hessian mercenaries fighting in the American Revolutionary War. However, these tales could have entered America's complex culture from multiple traditions simultaneously. Over time, cultural synthesis produced a common modern European image of the blood-sucking corpse. No longer just a villager born with a hair lip, the vampire became someone who chose the side of evil. This period also established the idea that vampires constantly crave blood and that their bite is contagious. In the 17th to 19th centuries, a restless corpse was identified by signs such as a body that did not decompose, showed no rigor mortis, and retained blood in the heart. The fight against vampires continued as the Western world embraced progress. Moreover, it was during this time that it became widespread and sporadic. Across Europe, particularly in the southeast, villagers and small-town residents reported attacks by the undead and opened graves to verify whether the dead were truly dead. Suspected vampires were buried in special ways. Graves were dug up, and if alarming signs were found, measures were taken. Depending on the region, methods varied. Bodies were decapitated, their legs bound, weighed down with slabs, or pierced with stakes. In some cases, the undead were appeased. Archaeologists have found offerings, such as coins, in graves. In the early 18th century, so many burial manipulations occurred in Austrian-controlled Balkan territories that Empress Maria Theresa sent the renowned physician Gerard van Swieten to investigate. After visiting Moravia, the enlightened doctor concluded that the issue stemmed from the superstitions and ignorance of rural folk. However, these stories reached newspapers, giving southeastern Europe a peculiar vampiric reputation. Many religious figures were also critical of vampire tales. Benedictine monk Augustin Calmet argued that the soul leaves the body at death, and thus the dead do not return to earth. Even Christian thinkers who described ghosts, he claimed, had succumbed to superstition. In his treatise on the appearance of spirits, Calmet described an epidemic of fear of ghosts, particularly vampires, that swept through Hungary, Silesia, Bohemia, Moravia, Poland, and Greece in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Notably, he grouped vampires and ghosts together. Calmet recounted stories of how people in these regions encountered unwelcome visitors and dealt with the undead. In Moravia, to rid themselves of a ghost that sat at the table with the living, the body was exhumed and burned. In Bohemia, suspected corpses were pinned to the ground with stakes. In Serbia, tales spoke of bloodsuckers who drank their victims' blood until they died of exhaustion. It was believed the undead should be decapitated and their graves doused with slaked lime. According to religious historian Jean Delumeau, such vampires served as scapegoats, uniting communities during the destruction of the undead. Vampire fears were also widespread in 19th-century Romania, the land of Dracula. An English traveler noted in 1828, "If a person dies a violent death, a cross is erected at the site to prevent them from becoming a vampire." Archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of anti-vampire practices in Eastern Europe. Between 2008 and 2012, at the historic cemetery in Drosko, Poland, researchers found remains buried with sickles across their necks or abdomens. Others had heavy stones placed on their necks. Genetic tests to determine if the deceased were outsiders, and thus suspicious, disproved the stranger hypothesis. Researchers concluded that these individuals were distrusted for other reasons, such as suspected witchcraft or being unbaptized. Sudden, strange, and mass deaths were always associated with malevolent forces. During plagues, the first to die was often labeled a vampire. Gerard van Swieten suggested that the high mortality in villages gripped by exhumation panic was caused by epidemics. This theory is now widely accepted and may explain why vampires were sought so frequently in certain regions. In Poland, cholera raged during the rituals performed over the Drosko Werdalax, vampires. However, as cholera progresses quickly and leaves no visible traces on skeletons, this hypothesis remains unconfirmed. Sometimes the vampire myth is linked to porphyria, a condition that can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight and tint teeth reddish-brown. However, porphyria is a rare genetic disorder incompatible with a contagious disease model. Catalepsy likely also reinforced vampire legends. During exhumations, people sometimes found horrifying signs: bodies frozen in unnatural positions, gnawed lips, or torn nails. Given the difficulty of determining death in that era, such cases occurred, though probably less frequently than believed during the Victorian epidemic of taphophobia, fear of being buried alive. Vampire fears may also have been fueled by rabies epidemics. The contagious bite and prolonged unholy transformation resemble the disease's incubation period. By the 18th century, vampires began to adopt werewolf traits in legends, transforming into bats or wolves, animals that carry rabies. Roger Luckhurst, a specialist in Victorian literature and vampire myths, associates belief in vampires and werewolves with viruses. After contact with an infected animal, a person seemed to turn into a beast. Symptoms like aggression and hydrophobia support this analogy. However, lycanthropy is more complex. In early modern times, a mental disorder called lycanthropy was widespread, where individuals imagined themselves as wolves or other animals, tearing off clothes, biting, and running on all fours. Culturally, this behavior responded to modernity's attitudes toward corporeality. Over time, distinguishing mental illness from infectious disease became challenging. What is clear is that the vampire epidemic had many causes and cannot be reduced to a single illness. While investigating a colonial-era farmer's cemetery in Griswold, Connecticut, archaeologist Nick Bellantoni discovered a deformed skeleton in a broken coffin. The skull, belonging to farmer John Barber, was separated from the body, and the skeleton's ribs were shattered. Research revealed this was done 5 years after burial. It turned out that in nearby Jewett City, Connecticut, townspeople had exhumed relatives' bodies, suspecting them of vampirism. Numerous exhumations also occurred in Rhode Island. Across New England, family burials from the 1700s to early 1800s revealed mutilated skeletons. After consulting folklorist Michael Bell, who has studied vampirism for 30 years, Bellantoni realized why Barber's ribs were broken. Someone likely tried to extract his heart, probably to burn it. Over the years, Bell documented around 80 exhumations and believes hundreds more lie undiscovered. Ritual details varied. Sometimes relatives and neighbors secretly dug up bodies, while other times town leaders and clergy sanctioned the procedure. In Maine and Massachusetts, suspected vampires were turned face down. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, the deceased's heart was burned, and the smoke inhaled for healing. The most famous American vampire incident, the case of Mercy Brown, occurred in Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892. The Brown family suffered from consumption, tuberculosis. The mother and 2 daughters died, while the son was ill but still alive. According to the belief that multiple deaths in a family were caused by the undead, neighbors suspected one of the deceased was a vampire secretly drinking their kin's blood. The bodies were exhumed from a stone crypt in the presence of a local doctor and a reporter. The mother and elder daughter's bodies had decomposed, but Mercy Lena Brown's body was nearly untouched by decay, with fresh blood in her heart. Her heart and liver were burned, the ashes mixed with water, and given to her sick brother to drink. 2 months later, he died. Mercy Brown's exhumation made headlines and sparked outrage. This was the late 1800s, amid the Industrial Revolution and progressive social ideas. It seems we have been transported to the dark ages of senseless ignorance and superstition, instead of living in the 19th century in a state that calls itself enlightened and Christian, wrote a Connecticut journalist after one such exhumation was publicized. The causes of the American vampire panic remain unclear. However, anti-vampire rituals almost always coincided with tuberculosis outbreaks. Analysis of John Barber's remains showed he suffered from this or a similar lung disease, suggesting entire families were infected, leading survivors to suspect deceased relatives of vampirism. Tuberculosis was not considered contagious for a long time. Although Robert Koch identified the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882, this discovery remained unknown in rural areas. Treatment at the time was limited to fresh air and sugar water. As Michael Bell notes, even the medical establishment, if honest, would have said, "We can't help, it's in God's hands." Thus, rural New Englanders sought solutions by attributing the disease to forces unknown to science. Today, we have ample evidence linking epidemics to waves of anti-vampire activity in early modern times. However, vampires are never just vampires. Even in popular culture, where bloodsuckers have shifted from horror to entertainment, they prompt reflections on eternal love and moral dilemmas. Vampires are a cultural phenomenon, reflecting human fears and aspirations. Their presence in culture allowed people to frame problematic situations in terms of vampirism. While many narratives tying vampire epidemics to infectious diseases are compelling, they ultimately address different ways of understanding the world. For example, the need to perform apotropaic rituals reflects a mythological worldview that persisted, albeit not fully, into the industrial 19th century. Michael Bell seeks to understand the roles of vampires and their accusers in life and death. I start with the assumption that past generations were no less intelligent than us. It's important to understand their logic. Labeling something just superstition cuts off the possibility of understanding what might have been entirely reasonable. The reasonable is not always rational. Facing horror, people sought solutions. The folk approach offers an alternative perspective. When Exeter, home of Mercy Brown, faced danger, maintaining social bonds took on new meaning. In a small community where an epidemic could spread like wildfire, demonstrating that all possible measures had been taken was crucial. Tuberculosis could infect the next family, so the Brown patriarch consented to the exhumation. Blood symbolizes not only life but also kinship, uniting people in a clan. In traditional societies, bonds extend not only among the living but also between the living and the dead. Rituals fulfilled a duty to the departed. Sudden, wrong deaths that caused the dead to return required symbolic correction through ritual. What seemed barbaric to progressive journalists and blasphemous to clergy was, for locals, a way to free Mercy Brown from a fate worse than death, undeath. The concept of feeding the dead sheds light on vampirism's meanings. In all traditional cultures, exchanges with ancestors through offerings were common. The living brought gifts and the dead granted blessings. Such offerings persist in some pagan traditions and Christian folk religiosity. It seems no coincidence that mass vampire panics erupted during the Enlightenment and Industrial era when progressive trends began to displace local superstitions. For folk consciousness, the idea that the dead, deprived of offerings, would come for their share resonated naturally. The theme of offerings merged with the image of the bloodthirsty Wurdelak, and in the Age of Reason, the dead began rising en masse to claim their due, draining the living's blood. No less significant than kinship was the fear of death. Embodying anti-life, a present absence, vampires symbolize a ravenous nothingness. Disease symptoms, epidemic spread, and viral mechanisms are explicable through medical science. Yet understanding practical causes and consequences does not illuminate the essence of death or the horror it inspires, which eludes positivistic sciences. It is unsurprising that facing mass mortality, residents of near-modern Europe and America turned to the language of myth, which dictated specific behaviors.